too long, because time for questions and answers is usually time well spent. So I'll just find my, where is it? Oh, so many windows. I believe that's it. Okay, so hopefully what you'll be able to see is a, oh, I can't see it myself now, is a presentation that's got mentoring program, the contrasting learning experience, CLE. If anybody can see that, would a couple of hands up would do me just to.
It's there, yeah.
Excellent, thank you so much. All right then, and away we go. Okay, so as you can see, it is about the contrasting learning experience, 70 days. The apprentices, some indeed have already started, but mostly they'll be starting this in January, usually before the 24th. So some things to consider. There is a template for the CLE agreement. It's very similar to previous mentor agreements, but as it's a kind of a new start, new people and different learning opportunities, we need to record that in some way. If you can start that now or as soon as you can or prior to the beginning of the placement, that would be good. Usually the people involved will be the on-site supervisor and the apprentice are the key people. The on-site supervisor may or may not be a line manager. It doesn't matter so much. And many mentors are continuing with their existing mentor, but not all of them are. So there may be a combination of those three people. Within 2 weeks of the placement starting, the SRA is supposed to join them and finalize that agreement. That's the idea. So as with any of these contracts, because it essentially is a contract of some description, really it's forming the relationship and working on it at the start and being clear about expectations is generally the key indicator of later success. When you don't pay attention to those things at the start, my years of practice education in all sorts of different ways tell me that things don't work out as well as they might. So I have some ideas about how you might consider or approach that. Again, some of you will have heard these before, so I hope you don't mind the repetition. So some basic things about CLE. If you were entirely new to this, I have had some email addresses, but I'm quite happy to talk to people individually or in small groups about the apprenticeship program and what kind of thing are involved. But of course, the apprentices are very well versed in the program at this stage, and you can also ask them. There are similarities to what we might call traditional, and I feel I could almost put inverted commas around traditional, since there are so many varieties of placement and ways of managing field learning or practice education. But there are also some differences. So practice education is a shared responsibility between the apprentice, mentor, and on-site supervisor and sub-regional assessor. As I said earlier, the on-site supervisor is going to be the person who's based in the contrasting learning experience. We don't stipulate that that person should have a particular role or qualification, but from what I've seen so far, they tend to be people who are adept at enabling learning and development. So they might be a practice educator or a person working with ASYEs, and sometimes they are also the line manager. So any combination of those kind of roles or skills would be fine. Obviously, we're developing and agreeing evidence together. All through the course to date, the apprentices have kept an index of evidence going, and we hope that they will continue to do that with the CLE. I suppose one of the key differences here is that the SRA, the sub-regional assessor, is responsible for the overall assessment of on-the-job learning.
Dermot, sorry to interrupt. Can I just say
please interrupt away.
Oh, yes, I think the slides are maybe a bit delayed moving forward.
I see. So what can you actually see right now?
So I think we're on slide, oh no, we're now on slide 3 or 2. I can't remember, but
I think that's 3. I can see now how I'm going to. So I'm moving on to the next slide, Susan. So tell me if you can now see one headed sections.
Yes.
Okay, right. I can see that I was moving the slides just by the cursor and not by clicking on the actual slide. So hopefully that won't happen again. So this contract, I call it that because that essentially is what it is. It starts off with contact details and the usual things. There's a little note about roles and responsibility, and then quite an important bit, which is getting to know and understand each other. You can check out our teaching partnership website, which is you can reach through that link, but we're going to talk about a couple of models that we use. And we use them because they work well, and they have proved to be very useful so far. So this is Social Graces. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this. It actually comes from family therapy. One of the things that my own learning about this from using it and seeing lots of other people use it is that it opens the conversation in a very kind of broad reaching way that generates a kind of very rich discussion. And so I'll continue bringing it up. Maybe there'll come a point where people will start pointing out, you know, what kind of deficits this particular model has, but it seems to be working very well so far. There is a second element to it, which we'll introduce later on, but one thing at a time. So I'll not say more about that, but when I send the slides out, I will also send the article here that the link is there for, but I'll actually send you the a PDF of the actual article. However, we know that one of the values of the model is that it gets at this bit, that what is visible and voiced and invisible and unvoiced and so on and so forth. Sometimes the conversation about identity, who we are, what is important to us can be difficult at times, but at the same time we are social workers after all, so this should be a conversation that we're kind of adept at and accustomed to. But really, when it's working well, these are the things that become visible and voiced throughout. We get a better picture of each other, a better understanding of each other as learners and enablers, and in that way generally have better outcomes. But of course, more than one model is available. Now, you may also have come across this. This is from Prosper Tatum, who started doing research on Black African students in particular, and started to notice that they had worse outcomes at all levels, including ASYE, and we have seen a recent ASYE report about this. And you kind of think, well, we've been talking about this for quite some time, and we're still seeing the same things. I mean, what's happening here? Well, it's a complex issue, perhaps not one that we could discuss in detail today, but we have at least a model that might go some way to addressing the kind of issues that we see over and over again, ad nauseum, really, to be honest. So there was an understanding of what was happening, but not tools to do something about it, right? And when Tatum talked to students who were failing placements, and then perhaps some students later on are newly qualified social workers failing in the ASYE, what they were talking about was homesickness, nipped wings, the sense of being held back, because a lot of these students were people who had done very well in other educational contexts, do you know what I mean? But this wasn't happening in practice education for some way. They had a lack of practice experience in general, and there were financial constraints. And as we know, money is a very powerful kind of driver of activity and behavior. But of particular significance, she notes, is the view by student participants that practice learning felt like another world. It was completely alien. It was kind of an entirely new way of doing things. And in a sense, people weren't kind of being inducted or introduced to this in a way that made sense to them. So she developed the Mandela model in response to this. And I'm not going to ask you to take two of these categories and discuss. I quite often do that. But this is what it's about. And I kind of think make time at the start is very important. have a kind of a general rule of thumb in social work that quite often, if you invest time at an early stage in your work with the people who come through our front doors, with students, with learners, with all sorts of people, to kind of understand and to kind of take time to understand what's going on for that person, things tend to be better. But you actually have to make an active will to do that. You have to decide and make that time, or else it doesn't happen. It isn't something that just happens kind of organically by magic in some strange sort of fashion. It was initially designed for Black African male students, but one of the interesting things we've seen so far in the apprentices is that people are using it in all sorts of different contexts, and it seems to work well with a lot of different students and apprentices. So that's been a kind of a pleasant learning for me. And again, I would recommend it to you as something that at the initial stages of the mentoring agreement in particular, and working together with the on-site supervisor would be very useful. We're always going to be missing things. Our models are approximations of the world, not exact descriptions. So we need our practice wisdom to come into play. And if it's necessary to connect with our apprentice in different ways, then that's up to us to kind of think creatively about that. And we also see examples of that, but I won't really have time to talk about that too much today. So the next 3 sections, again, this will be familiar to quite a few people, but I start off with the students' strengths, what they can do well, what they know. Our apprenticeships already come fully equipped with a whole series of abilities, knowledge, skills, all of that. They've already talked about it earlier, but the first time they did the mentoring agreements quite a little while ago now. They've learned a few things since then. So maybe it's an opportunity to take some of those things into account. Then we get to identify and agree learning needs. And as they're going into an entirely new setting, a new context, they may still know, because it may be within the same agency, possibly, but it doesn't have to be. They may still know a lot about that part of the agency and what kind of how things are done there, but they're not likely to have too much of an in-depth knowledge and experience. So here we're kind of aligning what's available in the placement with what their learning needs are. And then, of course, we get to identify and write the learning outcomes. And again, the only thing I would say about that is when writing learning outcomes, it generally is not sufficient just to write a list of things to do. Because, well, at least partly, this is because this is social work. So we generally use the phrase intended learning outcomes, because if we say something like shadow experience social worker on a home visit, or doing a mental capacity assessment, or whatever the activity might be, there might be a whole range of things that a student might learn. And even if they list what they are, of course, we all know in social work that sometimes things just go completely differently than we had expected or intended. So intended learning outcome is quite an important piece to this. But try to write the learning outcomes in such a way as there at least is an outline of what the intent in that. So, for example, let's just say the social workers, experienced social workers conducting an MCA. The student has never seen this before. They don't really know anything much about it. They know what the act is and so on and so forth. And what they want to find out is, how do you introduce this conversation? Who needs to be involved in the conversation and who will be there? What are the key questions that you need answering? Does the person use a checklist? No, perhaps not. Or do they have that as just kind of an internalized little script and they can just talk to it rather than actually sit there taking notes and so on and so forth? So let's have a bit more description about what the learning opportunity will involve. An induction is a generally a good idea. Social Work England's guidance is all about inductions. In some ways, if your apprentice is within your agency, there are a lot of induction activities that you would do with a student in a normal placement that you will not have to do here. You will not have to induct them into, essentially, really, what we're doing with a lot of students is inducting them as members of staff, even if only for a temporary kind of period of time. So There might be things you don't have to do. We have suggested, because we're thinking about ways about how to save days and how you can do the 70 days in the allotted time. You can do some of those inductions prior to the actual start of the placement. So, for example, there's nothing to stop an apprentice actually reading policy documents, perhaps, or things about practice models or legislation that might be available. And I always like to see students do a little bit of research before they arrive in a placement, and you could count that towards an induction time. So that might be something that you could do, or they could maybe sit in on a team meeting. Or recently I've come across a student who was going to meet a group of other students who were currently in that same setting. So if you can devote a few days prior to the actual start of the placement, that might give you a little bit more flexibility as as it progresses. An initial pre-placement meeting is always a good idea if you can possibly manage that, and that would be a good way to start off perhaps that mentoring agreement, some of those other activities I've talked about earlier. So this is the indicative timetable. Now, I'm not going to go through it in great detail because I will immediately after this meeting send you out this. And in fact, Susan's got a better version of it, CLE guidance, which is a bit more detailed. It covers some of the things that you might be thinking about asking today. Don't let me stop you asking questions. But I think that might be a better way to go. But as you can see, it starts for some students, if they're working part-time hours, it starts towards the end of December. In the main, most people will start in January. Within about 14 days, thereabouts in the first 2 weeks, the CLE agreement meeting, so we try to get that finalised, working on the assumption that we've done some preparatory work beforehand. By about day 35, so about midway point, the first direct observation should be done. Now, this will be a new client group quite often for the students, so might be some anxiety involved in this, and that's part of the reason that the SRA will do that first direct observation. So that's our intent. It also sets the tone for and expectations about the standards of direct observations that we expect. As the placement continues, or the CLE continues, written critical reflection, and then roughly about 10 days before the end of the CLE, we ask for a second direct observation. We ask, I mean, there's some flexibility in this, but that gives a bit of time for write-ups to be done. You might want to seek feedback from the person with lived experience and so on. So we decided roughly 2 weeks beforehand. But if it's a little later, it's not the end of the world. We're just trying to take into account the amount of documents that generally need to be gathered and finalised. There'll be a final review. I seem to have entirely missed the midway review, but there is a midway review. Again, we kind of gather evidence and collectively decide a plan for the remaining half of the placement. I'm very sorry for going back, bad form on my part, but I think you get the general idea. Then we'll ask for second critical reflection on learning. There's a portfolio submission you can see here is on the 13th of June. Now, there is possibility of submission being a little bit later. Partly the days are determined by university processes that these portfolios have to be seen by a practice assessment panel. Some of you have perhaps joined our previous panels at Kingston, and then it has to go to a board of studies, so on and so forth. So there are processes, quality assurance processes that are required, which is why really the dates are constrained by those two, 13th and 27th of June. There's a Viva week in which they will do a verbal presentation on learning of the CLE. They did that last year, so they're not entirely unfamiliar with that kind of process, and we expect that to be okay, really. And that's my snapshot tour. I'm sure you'll have quite a few questions. I will take away the presentation now, and the floor is yours. I'll also stop the recording. Even though I'm in two minds about that, I think that's probably the best.